Welcome to part two. My video recorder timed out. I ran out of time, so I'm going to pick up where we left off. Where we left off, Jimmy was distracted. He was beyond his control. But like I said, I think we can feel some sympathy for him because we ourselves may have tuned out. But the problem that while he's doing that, he's not aware of his environment. Ted Lavender is shot in the head. Spoiler alert. On his way back from the latrine. Here's the situation. When they go into the tunnel, not only is there the possibility that there are enemies underground, but there's also the possibility that there are enemy soldiers in the vicinity. So there should be they should have this focus on the dangers of the environment, but because Jimmy has kind of checked out and he's daydreaming, he's not tuned in to what the men are doing and what their circumstances are, and Ted wanders away from the group, the call of nature, and talk about vulnerable, right? You're shot in probably one of the most vulnerable moments that you can have. This becomes a very significant moment for Jimmy because he's lost one of his men and he's the commanding officer. The responsibility falls on him. So I want to take a minute to kind of segue. I'm going to come back to this, but I'd like to segue into another portion of the text because that's what our narrator does. So Ted Lavender's shot, dead, body's carried away. And then we get this kind of aside, this digression from our narrator, where he talks about how the things that they carried were determined by superstition. For example, one of the men carries a rabbit foot. Jimmy has the pebble. It's good luck charm. And Norman Baugher, he gives Mitchell Sanders the thumb of a Vietnamese boy that the soldiers find dead. And it's interesting. They say that it weighs 4 ounces. I think that part of the struggle for Jimmy, part of the struggle for the men, is that they have this they're on this quest, right? And I think that if you think about the Vietnam War as a whole, it was a very misunderstood war. It was not one that was supported largely by the general public in America. Nobody wanted to fight. Everybody protests the war, and they didn't understand what their role was. They didn't understand what they were doing there. And as I said earlier, that they're wandering around directionless, and part of the challenge with these guys is that they're on this quest for meaning. What's the point? And there's this meaning, finding meaning in the experience. And Mitchell Sanders, our resident philosopher, says that there's a definite moral here with the young boy, but none of them can figure it out. He's told to F off when he tries to get too much into it. But they had, and the narrator even says that they had no sense of strategy or mission. They searched villages without knowing what to look for, not caring, kicking over jars of rice, frisking children and old men, blowing tunnels, sometimes setting fires, sometimes not, then forming up and moving to the next village, then other villages where it would always be the same. They carried their own lives. They carried it on their backs and shoulders. And for all the ambiguities of Vietnam, all the mysteries and unknowns, there was at least a single abiding certainty that they would never be at a loss for things to carry. And I, as a reader, wonder if that's the moral that Sanders may be pointing out with this younger boy, that this boy is carrying a bag of rice and a weapon. Symbolically, he's carrying food and protection. And it's not enough. It doesn't save him. He's killed, and these things these soldiers are carrying isn't really enough to prevent the inevitable. So I think this boy is also an example of the loss of innocence for both sides. He's a young 15-year-old kid, and I can imagine that that's not something easily forgotten, and the thumb serves as this kind of tangible reminder. And the narrator says that they share the weight of the memory of the things that they've seen. They take up what others could no longer bear. Often they carried each other, the wounded, the weak. After the chopper took Lavender away, Jimmy Cross leads his men into a village. I can't pronounce the name of the village. Tonki, I'm guessing. They burned the village, and in a sense, they punished the people for Ted Lavender's death. But that's not the only punishment that's served. Jimmy punishes himself because he felt shame. He hated himself. He had loved Martha more than his men. As a consequence, he'll carry the guilt and the shame like a stone in his stomach. And I think that it's interesting to look at that parallel between the stone of guilt, the stone of shame, in the pit of his stomach, and the pebble that distracts him. I don't know, I just think that there's something in that, and I hope that you guys will bring that up in maybe a discussion board or discussion post. But I think it's also interesting that Jimmy feels this grief for Ted, but really he feels sorry for himself, for Martha, because she belonged to another world, stuck with the intangible weight and the burden of guilt. And how does Jimmy punish himself? Well, he digs a hole in the ground, cries, and he burns Martha's pictures and letters. I mean, it's like he doesn't deserve them. And I think if we think symbolically about this idea of fire, it is inherently a destructive force. He's destroying his distraction. He's destroying that hope that he can come out of this experience intact, that hope that he can remain unchanged. And in some ways, this hole is like a grave, right? He goes there and part of him dies in that hole. But fire, in addition to being destructive, it's also rejuvenative. It's restorative. If people want, forests to grow back, they burn them first and replant them. So in some ways, that's kind of like Jimmy. Jimmy goes into the ground. It's a weird way to say that. He goes into that hole. He burns the letters, one man, and then kind of a young boy, and he comes back a man. So in some ways, it's the loss of his innocence. It's the one thing that kind of anyways, I don't want to talk too much about that because it's one of your discussion board options. And anyways, it does have a very profound effect on Jimmy. But I also want to talk about the profound effect that Lavender's death has on the other men. For example, Kiowa, he can't stop talking about it, even when the other men don't want to hear about it. But his death also prompts these very real thoughts of how quickly death can come and how thankful he is to be breathing. And in fact, in some ways, he's very numb to the experience altogether. The war has taken a toll on him. For example, the text tells us that he enjoyed not being dead, lying there. He admired Jimmy Cross's capacity for grief. He wanted to share the man's pain. He wanted to care as Jimmy Cross cared. And yet he closed his eyes. All he could think of was boom down. And all he could feel was the pleasure of having his boots off and the fog curling around him. So in a lot of ways, he's hardened. He sees Jimmy crying, and he's like, I wish that I could feel that. But in some ways, I don't think that Jimmy's crying for Ted Lavender. I think that Jimmy's crying for himself. But anyways, I think that this is very much a realistic detail that we can all appreciate because they've witnessed this very traumatic event, and it's psychologically damaging and difficult to process. And who knows how we'd respond. So we have a switch here in the story after Ted Lavender's death. the narrator stops telling us about the physical things that they carry and shifts into a discussion of the psychological and emotional burdens that these men have to carry as a result of their experience. These burdens that can't be put down. And I'm gonna run out of time again. Okay. I'll save that. But there's this section where Mitchell Sanders makes this joke about the moral of Ted Lavender's death being to stay away from drugs. They'll kill you. And they made themselves laugh. And again, there are these men here at war, and they're under enormous pressure to not only conceal their fears and their own anxiety, but to really cover over their fears that they carry and all the emotional baggage of men who might die. And there's some really beautiful, lovely language and quotes and stuff where he talks about how they're afraid to be cowards, and the way that they cope with that is that fear is to make to pretend it's all a big joke. They pretend it's okay, and I think that what our narrator is trying to tell us, that's probably one of the most challenging burdens for the men to carry. It's the psychological burden. All those burdens can change a person, and all those burdens never go away. Jimmy says that Lavender's dead, and you can't burn blame, but it takes the death of his men that it makes him realize he needs to get his shit together, and that war comes at a cost. If this were a story about a group of soldiers experiencing time in a jungle and difficult missions, but a vast majority of us have never seen active military service, so I'm not certain that this would really resonate or that it would be something for us to take away. But I think what's really great here with the skill of Tim O'Brien and the achievement that he makes in writing this work is to kind of give us this analogy really for life. All of us are carrying our own set of physical things, material things, all day to day. Like, I carry crap everywhere. Our purses, our backpacks, our wallets, whether we need it or not. We can relate to that in a way, but more importantly, I think we can relate because we all carry our own emotional burdens and baggage, because we find ourselves in circumstances not of our own making, situations that we didn't choose, and some of those go well, some of them don't. A large majority of them don't. We all make mistakes, and we realize that in making mistakes, other people get hurt. And people get hurt because of something that we've done or not done. We can all identify with Jimmy because we can all say at some point, I've screwed up. And we have to live with the consequences of something that we've done. One of the major themes in this story, I think, is the loss of innocence. And as we grow up, we face more challenging experiences. We lose that innocence. And I think one of the questions Tim O'Brien explores here is that, does a loss of innocence also mean a loss of humanity? Do we give up a bit of ourselves, or does it make us more human? More specifically, is that a cost of war? And there's also that element of trying to make sense of circumstances. We've all been put in positions that we didn't understand, and we want answers really badly, and in reality there aren't any. So this story, it's kind of an analogy for life. We go through carrying emotional baggage and physical burdens of all sort, and like Jimmy Cross, we have to decide to take ownership of ourselves. It would be remiss of me to not say something about Ted Lavender's name being Ted Lavender. Ted meaning teddy bear. Lavender, it's this kind of pastel-y, pink, purpley color that's associated with youth. And we're meant to see him as this analogous, as an analogous character to a young person, and someone who is so overwhelmed and so overcome with fear that he's really incapable of what one might say is manning up every time he's